Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Siddiq, the father of Holophase. Part 27, The Last Thing Standing. We have been walking downward for a long time. Not downward into darkness like falling, but downward like digging, layer after layer, until your hands stop hitting soil and start hitting stone. Until you realize you are no longer moving through things, you are moving through prerequisites, through the conditions that must already be true for anything else to be speakable at all. In part 25, we placed mathematics in its proper seat, a map, not the territory, a language that can describe patterns with breathtaking power, but only because patterns are already possible. In part 26, we placed purpose in its proper seat, an aim that can arise inside a world, not a goal hidden in the foundation of the world. The mirror does not intend. Gravity does not want. The loom does not dream of carpets. Phi does not aim. It allows aiming. And now we arrive at the most stripping question of all. The kind of question that doesn't feel like curiosity anymore. It feels like the final test of whether you truly understand what we've been doing. If phi is the permission layer, if phi is what makes this, not that, possible, then what happens if we try to remove everything that is this or that? What happens if we remove every distinguishable content? What remains when all is removed? This is part 27, and its core insight is brutally simple. When you strip away everything distinguishable, what remains is not a secret object hiding behind the world. What remains is the capacity for distinction itself, the permission for anything to ever differ from anything else. That capacity is phi, and it is the last thing standing when everything else falls. Now I'm going to firewall this in the cleanest way possible, because this part is where people smuggle without noticing. They smuggle being. They smuggle existence. They smuggle a substance beneath all substances. They smuggle a divine essence. They smuggle a primal energy. No, not here. One primitive, phi, comparability. The permission for same and different to even mean something. We do not add anything else. We do not use existence as a deeper explanation. We do not treat phi as a thing inside a world. Phi is the permission for world talk. So today we are not trying to discover a hidden object. We are doing a subtraction, an honest subtraction. We are taking away everything that can be taken away without collapsing meaning itself. And we are seeing what cannot be taken away. Because if you remove it, you remove the very possibility of removal. Think of it like this. If you try to remove the floor while you're standing on it, you don't end up with a deeper floor. You end up falling into incoherence. The floor is not a fancy object. It's a condition. Phi is that kind of floor. Let me show you in everyday language, with images you can actually feel. Imagine a room, your room, not an abstract one. You can see it right now. The bed, the chair, the phone charger, a cup, a jacket, maybe a book with a bent cover, maybe a window that catches the afternoon light. Now do the first simple removal. Take the objects out. Remove the cup, remove the chair, remove the bed, remove the book. The room becomes empty, but it still feels like a room. Why? Because you can still make distinctions. Wall versus floor, corner versus center, here versus there, even empty versus not empty. The emptiness still has structure because you can still compare. Now remove the next layer. Remove the walls. Remove the ceiling. Remove the floor. Don't imagine rubble. Imagine it vanishing cleanly. What remains? Most people say space. But even that word is already a step too fast, because space is a later concept in our larger program. So let's speak more carefully. What remains is whatever it is that allows you to still have a sense of here rather than there, of near rather than far, even if nothing is placed anywhere. It's the container feeling of separateness. Now remove the air, remove the temperature, remove the dust, remove every object and medium. People call that vacuum, but again, don't cling to the label. Just keep removing. Now the final removal, the one that hurts the mind. Remove even the where. Remove location itself. Remove the ability to point. Remove the difference between this side and that side. Remove the very notion of place. Now ask the question again. What remains? If you say nothing, you haven't noticed the trap, because nothing is already a comparison. Nothing is not something. It is a contrast word. It is built from the very permission we are investigating. So what remains is not nothing, and it is not something in the usual sense either. What remains is the only thing we have not yet removed, the permission for there to be a difference at all. The bare could-be-ness that something could be placed, something could be marked, something could be distinguished, if anything ever happens. You can destroy every chair, every wall, every molecule, everywhere. But if you still speak meaningfully about removal, you have not removed the permission for difference, because removal itself is a difference, before versus after, with versus without, gone versus present. This is why phi is not a thing in the room. It is what makes room, object, empty, remove, and remain meaningful words in the first place. Now bring the thought experiment closer. Let's not talk about rooms. Let's talk about you. Imagine complete amnesia. Not the ordinary kind where you forget a password, but full erasure. Your name is gone. Your language is gone. Your memories are gone. Your skills are gone. The story of me is gone. You wake up and you cannot recognize your own life. What remains? This is not poetry. This is a precise test. If everything you know is gone, what is left that still allows any knowing to ever happen again? What remains is not a specific memory. Those are erased. What remains is not a specific concept. Those are erased. What remains is not a specific identity that was built from continuity and narrative. What remains is the ability to form new distinctions. You look at a white wall. You distinguish wall from not wall. You hear a sound. You distinguish sound from silence. You feel cold. You distinguish cold from warm. You feel pain. You distinguish pain from calm. You are not yet educated. You are not yet yourself. But something is still operating. The primitive ability for this experience to be different from that experience. That is the engine of rebuilding. That is the seed of learning. That is the first door back into a world. Amnesia can destroy content. It cannot destroy the capacity for content to be distinguished, because if that capacity were destroyed, there would be no learning, no recognition, no recovery, no orientation. There would be no again. Phi is exactly that. Not the content, but the capacity for content to become distinguishable. Now take the amnesia scene one step deeper. Suppose you wake up and there is a nurse. They say something to you. You don't understand the words, but you still detect something. The tone is different from silence. The face is different from the wall. The motion is different from stillness. Even without understanding, you are already inside phi, because the first comparison has already happened. And this is why phi is not knowledge. Phi is what makes knowledge possible. It is what remains when knowledge collapses. Now let me return to the image we've carried through this episode, the factory beneath hell, because it is not just dramatic decoration, it is an operational test of what collapses first and what does not. There were moments when the darkness was not only outside the eyes, but inside the mind. Moments when the future felt sealed, when meaning drained away, when hope became a word you couldn't quite pronounce anymore. In those moments, many things fell. Plans fell, stories fell, purpose fell. Even the feeling of tomorrow fell. The patterns on the carpet could no longer comfort you because the mind was too exhausted to hold beauty. So what remained? Something small, almost insulting in its simplicity. This moment differs from that moment. This breath is not the previous breath. This pain is not yesterday's pain. Even when everything meaningful collapsed, difference did not collapse. Comparison did not collapse. The raw noticing, now is not then, still flickered. And that flicker mattered more than any philosophy. Because if even that flicker died, if now could not be distinguished from then you would not be inside a world. You would be inside white noise. Inside a blur so perfect that nothing could be said. Nothing could be remembered. Nothing could be learned. Nothing could be endured. The last thread connecting you to reality was not a theory. It was the ability to tell that this is not that. That thread is phi. And notice how firewall this is. I'm not saying phi is hope. Hope is a later pattern. I'm not saying phi is meaning. Meaning is a later pattern. I'm not saying phi is consciousness. Consciousness is a later pattern. I'm saying something colder and cleaner and more dependable. If there is any recoverable world at all, any world you can return to, there must remain a comparability structure. There must remain the permission for difference. That permission is phi. Now, many people hear this and immediately try to turn it into a mystical object. Ah, so phi is the ultimate substance. No, stop. Firewall. That is exactly the smuggling this part exists to prevent. Let me give you an analogy that makes the difference unmistakable. Think of a blank canvas, a real canvas, stretched tight. Before any paint touches it, there is no picture, no face, no landscape, no story, just blankness. But what is that blankness? It is not an image. It is not art yet. It is not meaning yet. It is the possibility of mark making. It is the permission for here to be different from there once paint arrives. It is the permission for a stroke to exist and be distinguishable from the background. Now tear the canvas, burn it, destroy it. Have you destroyed the possibility of painting forever? No. Another canvas can be made. Another surface can receive marks. The possibility was never identical to that specific piece of cloth. The possibility is deeper than the specific material instance. So the possibility of painting is not a thing you can point to on the canvas. It is a condition that can be realized in many materials. Phi is like that, but even more basic. Phi is not one canvas. Phi is the permission layer for any canvas-like situation. Any situation in which a mark could differ from a not mark. Any situation in which comparison could occur. Now shift from painting to music, because music reveals something that most people miss. In music, the silence between notes is not just absence. It is structure. It is part of the rhythm. It is the shape of expectation. But silence only means anything because it is distinguishable from sound. If there were no possible difference between sound and silence, there would be no concept of silence. There would be no rhythm. There would be no music. It would be a smear. Now imagine absolute silence, no notes at all. Still, the idea of silence presupposes that sound could happen and would be different. Silence is meaningful only because difference is possible. So even if you remove all sounds, you have not removed the permission for sound to be different from no sound. And that permission is phi. Push it further. Imagine removing not only sound, but even the concept of sound. Imagine a state where no contrast is possible. Then even the word silence breaks, because silence is a contrast term. It depends on the possibility of something else. So again, the last thing standing is not silence. It is the permission for contrast. That permission is phi. Now I want to bring in the most human example of all, a newborn. A newborn arrives without language, without concepts, without the long story of a self. The world arrives as a flood. Light, touch, temperature, sound, movement, hunger, comfort. But slowly, and this is the miracle, distinctions begin to form. Warm versus cold, familiar voice versus unfamiliar, hunger versus fullness, safe arms versus empty air. Before there is knowledge, there is difference. Before there is meaning, there is distinguishability. Before there is truth, there is the capacity for experiences to not all be the same blur. That capacity is not learned from a textbook. It is not taught by a teacher. It is the precondition for any teaching to take hold. That capacity is phi. So now we can state part 27 in a way that is both emotionally real and logically strict. When you strip away the world's content, objects, names, stories, goals, even the shapes of things, you have not reached the secret object beneath the world. You have reached a permission that cannot be removed without removing the very meaning of removal. Phi is that permission. Now we must make this operational. Because the firewall is not satisfied by beautiful sentences. The firewall demands, what do we predict and what would prove us wrong? Here is the prediction in the simplest possible form. If phi is truly irreducible, then any attempt to reduce phi to something more fundamental will secretly use phi in the act of reduction. It will smuggle comparability back in. It will do this even if the person doing it is brilliant. Even if they do it with equations. Even if they do it with deep metaphysics. Because the moment someone says phi is really just x, they must already be able to distinguish phi from not phi, x from not x, correct from incorrect, explanation from non-explanation. They must compare the claim to alternatives. They must assert that one description matches better than another. But all of those moves, distinguish, compare, match, are phi. So the prediction is that reduction will become circular unless it openly admits that comparability is being presupposed. And this is not a cheap trick. It is not wordplay. It is the structure of what explanation is. Explanation is itself a comparative act. To explain is to distinguish what matters from what doesn't, to separate cause from non-cause, to identify what matches and what contradicts. That's not optional. That's what explain means. So if phi is the permission for comparison, then explanation itself sits on phi. That means you cannot explain phi in a way that does not already assume phi, unless you invent a form of explanation that is not explanation, one that does not distinguish anything from anything. That is our prediction. Now, what is the falsification? What would kill this claim? The falsification is as sharp as a blade. Reduce phi to something more fundamental without using comparability anywhere in the reduction. Do not compare phi to your proposed deeper thing. Do not distinguish steps. Do not distinguish true from false. Do not use any language that depends on distinction. Do not rely on before and after, with and without, same and different, works and fails. In other words, explain comparability without comparing. If someone can do that, if they can genuinely provide a coherent, publicly checkable reduction of phi that does not presuppose phi, then part 27 collapses. And notice, that is a real falsification demand. It is not go prove a unicorn. It is a precise criterion. Show a reduction that is not circular. If it exists, we must accept it. But we also see why it is so difficult. Because even the act of showing seems to require distinction. Even the act of publicly checkable seems to require shared comparability. So the falsification condition is not easy. But not easy does not mean not real. It means the claim is strong. Now let's add coherence, because coherence is the heartbeat of this program. Everything we have said depends on a simple idea. A coherent reality is one in which comparisons can stabilize, where same remains same enough to be recognized, where different remains different enough to be meaningful, where patterns can persist long enough to be shared. When coherence collapses, the world becomes noise. When coherence rises, the world becomes readable. Part 27 is saying, coherence itself is downstream of phi. Coherence is a property of how patterns behave once distinctions exist. But phi is the permission for distinctions to exist at all. So phi is not a coherent object. Phi is the permission that makes coherence talk possible. Now I'm going to do one final image, one that seals this in the mind. Imagine a mirror standing in an empty room. Nothing in front of it. No face, no light, no objects. The mirror reflects nothing. But is it no longer a mirror? No. It is still a mirror because it still has the capacity to reflect if something appears. It is ready even in emptiness. Now shatter the mirror. Destroy every mirror. Remove every reflective surface. Have you destroyed the capacity for reflection as a concept? Not really, because the idea reflection is possible or not possible already uses contrast. And as soon as you talk about possible, you are talking about difference. So the deeper point is this. The specific mirror is not the capacity. The capacity is a condition that can be realized in many instances. Phi is like the capacity, not like the mirror. Phi is the readiness of reality to become distinguishable. Even if nothing is distinguished, the permission for distinguishing has not been removed, because if it were removed, you could not meaningfully say removed. This is why we call phi the last thing standing. Not because it is a giant object that remains after the universe is emptied, like a statue in a cleared field, but because it is what must remain true, structurally, if anything like a field, a statue, a clearing, or a remain can be spoken without contradiction. Now let me say the memory hook in a way you can carry like a single stone in your pocket. Phi is the last thing standing when everything else falls. If you remember nothing else from part 27, remember that, because it protects you from two errors that ruin deep thinking. The first error is to treat the foundation as a thing, to imagine you will find a hidden substance beneath everything. But the foundation here is not a thing, it is a permission. The second error is to treat the foundation as mystical and untouchable. But we are touching it right now, operationally, by seeing that every act of explanation, every act of truth testing, every act of meaning, every act of learning, every act of survival under comparison presupposes the capacity for distinction. That capacity is not beyond reason. It is the precondition of reason. And now, if we're honest, part 27 forces the next question to appear, almost automatically. It has haunted people for centuries, and it will try to haunt us too. Why is there something rather than nothing? But now we can already sense the trap, can't we? Because something versus nothing is itself a distinction. The question is built from the very permission it is trying to get behind. It's like asking, using language, why language exists. The question carries what it asks for inside its own mouth. That is part 28. For now, stay here at bedrock with me. We removed objects. We removed stories. We removed purposes. We removed descriptions. We removed even our favorite comforts, mathematics and meaning. And we did not fall into emptiness. We fell into a silent permission, the permission that this can differ from that. That permission is phi. And that is why, when everything else falls, phi remains. Not as a leftover thing, but as the condition that makes falling, remaining, removing, and asking intelligible actions in the first place. That is the last thing standing. And now, we are ready to face the question that pretends to be deeper than bedrock, and discover why it cannot be. Peace be upon you.